Well, today we're going to continue through Matthew's Gospel, and we've been in section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, and that is roughly from about the end of chapter 20, and that's all the way through to the very end of chapter 25. So as I've outlined Matthew, that's one section as I understand it. And this section describes the events of the final visit that Jesus made to Jerusalem in the very week before his crucifixion. So we're very much coming near to the end of the ministry of Jesus. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And when he gets to Jerusalem at this time, he has a whole lot to say about the things they've been saying about him, which is basically how this comes down. And he gives the final verdict, so to speak, on their response to his ministry. Well, as of now, I'm teaching through a portion of that, the last portion of that section. And this is, of course, a sermon that Jesus gave to his disciples, just to his disciples, answering some questions they had. And this happens on the Mount of Olives, just outside of Jerusalem. So we tend to call this the Olivet Discourse. It's chapter 24 and 25 altogether. And in this portion, Jesus predicts and describes the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and the end of the age. So it's like one very cataclysmic time for Israel, and then something that concerns the whole world. And that's his return, of course. Now, we have made it to the 8th passage of the Olivet Discourse. We are approaching the halfway mark, really. And in this passage, he's making the point that no one knows the time of his return. So let's read this again. We're going to read Matthew 24, verses 36 through 42 this time, where he gives his own application for the things he says. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. I've already done 2 sermons on this passage, and today's sermon will be my final sermon on this passage by itself. So we're coming to the end of our discussion of this particular passage of the Olivet Discourse. Today I want to talk to you about the Unwavering Watch, as I have called it, and that's my title for this sermon as well, the Unwavering Watch. And that, of course, is also the true purpose of this passage. That's the therefore that Jesus gives us at the very end of it. And to begin our discussion of this, I have a question for the older brothers and sisters in the group, that is, of the children among us, the older brothers and sisters, the ones who should be more responsible than the younger brothers and sisters. Hopefully they are. Just to ask you a question, have any of you ever been told by your parents to watch a younger brother or sister? Like maybe while your parents are busy doing something, or they're just not able to keep their eye on the younger kids. Have any of you older kids ever been told to watch the younger kids? Maybe you've got some head nodding going on here, like some smirking maybe. Okay, very good. So let's say you fail to watch the younger child, and the younger child gets into some kind of trouble, or makes a mess, does something they should not do. So you failed in your mission to watch this particular child. When the parent finds out about the trouble that the younger child has caused, who actually gets in trouble? If it's the younger child, who actually sort of takes the heat for things that happened? Let's say, the older one. The older one actually gets in trouble, perhaps worse than the younger one. And of course, the reason for that is because the older kid was supposed to be watching the younger kid and did not do so. and nothing bad would have happened if the older kid would have just done his job. Well, as you know, as too many of you probably know, that's the kind of thing that happens, and that's the way it works, right? When you're given the command to watch, your job is actually to watch. And when you're watching a younger child in particular, you actually have to watch continually. Turning your back for just a minute is too much. Like, you're giving them too much time to get into some kind of trouble, and it usually just cascades from there. So the watch you have to perform is a continual kind of watching. You've got to keep your eye on them to make sure that nothing bad's going to happen. Now, this sermon is about much the same thing on just a much greater scale, on matters of eternal consequence, because we're still talking about watching and continually watching and having a responsibility to do that and bearing the consequences for not doing that if you fail. In today's passage, we see that the nature of God's judgment at the Lord's return should make us watchful in the same way that you should be watching that younger child or any situation in which it's important for you to actually observe and be on the alert about something. Same thing. That is exactly what Jesus has in mind for disciples as they await his return, to be watchful. My outline today has 4 headings. Some of this overlaps with things I have already said, but we're getting really more into applicational type things with these points. First of all, the time of the Lord's return is unknown even to those who should know. So there are certain people who ought to be aware of when Jesus is coming back, but they are not aware because God has not told them that. We'll talk about that a little bit. And secondly, the time of the Lord's return is scheduled during worldly distractions. So as you're trying to watch, there are a great number of things that are trying to get in the way of your watching so that you cannot watch effectively. Third, the time of the Lord's return comes with a selective judgment, meaning that there is some very precise divine vengeance going to be at work at that time, which is the whole reason you ought to be watching to begin with. And then finally, the time of the Lord's return should be met with fear, faithfulness, and forethought. So if you want some concluding applicational thoughts, that's where this is all actually going. Fear, faithfulness, and forethought. Now, in some sense, this unwavering watch that I'm talking about, that we're supposed to be exercising toward the Lord's return, it includes everything about the Christian life. And maybe you've never viewed it that way, but if you want to know what it means to be a Christian, it actually can be summarized as waiting for the Lord's return and watching for the Lord's return. All that we do and much of what we believe really is focused on that one day when Christ returns. We are very much a people that live between 2 moments. The first moment is the first coming of Christ, and the other moment is the second coming of Christ. We're kind of caught between those 2 things, and that defines all that we are. Now, we often hear it said in other contexts that we only die once, and therefore we need to die well. And that advice might be good on some occasions, for sure, but in reality, that attitude that is meant by that statement, you only die once, so you better die well, that attitude should be directed, for the most part, at something else, and that is the Lord's return. You only get one chance to greet Jesus when he returns, so you better be waiting at the door and watching and make sure it's a good one, because you only got that one time to get it right. And that really is the summation of the Christian life. And that's what we're talking about today. So let's begin with the first of those 4 headings that I gave you, talking about this in some more detail. And the first point to make is that the time of the Lord's return is unknown even to those who should know. Now, I have several groups of people in mind as I think of that, and this is nothing new. Jesus mentions at least 2 of them directly in this passage, and one of them is implied. The first group of people who should know but don't know is the believers, the actual disciples of Jesus. This is the one that's implied because, after all, Jesus is speaking to believers at this point. And really, of all the people in the world, we have the most vested interest in the return of Christ, because the fulfillment of that promise is the foundation of our every hope. Everything that we really hope to be true, like we go through all these things as Christians, We learn things, we repent of sins, we try to be the best representative of Christ we can be in any given situation. And all for what? Well, we're hoping that he actually is coming, that he brings his reward with him, that he'll deliver us from our enemies, from our sins, from temptations, and bring us into all the stuff that he has promised us. Everything we do is focused on that. So we have the most vested interest in his return, more than anyone. And in most cases, as you think about life in general, we expect to know when our hopes will be fulfilled. We at least have some idea of that. When we start college, we have a good idea of when we're going to graduate and finally be able to use what we've learned in an actual career. When we take out a loan on a house, right, we expect to know roughly when that loan will be repaid. We may even have a calendar set up, marking down the days until we should hopefully have this, repaid, right? When we plan a vacation, we expect to know when we're going to leave, when we're going to return, what kind of stuff we're going to be doing on that vacation. And as long as nothing goes horribly wrong, we usually have a pretty good idea of how this stuff works and how long the time frame is. And yet, Christians most certainly do not know when Christ will return, even though our hopes are entirely set on his return. We should know this. This is information that is, you almost would say it's essential for our survival as Christians, but it's one thing we certainly don't know. So we don't know, even though we should. Now, the second group I have in mind is one that Christ mentions in particular in this passage, and that is the angels. The angels do not know the time of the Lord's return. Now, Christ has already established earlier in the Olivet Discourse the role of the angels in his return, because they have a job to do at that time. And if you back up to verses 29 and 30 and 31, especially verse 31, you'll actually see what that is. They have the job of gathering the elect. So when the Son of Man comes, he sends forth his angels, and they gather his people together at that time. So they have a job to do at the time of the Lord's return. Now, if you are part of some planned endeavor, whatever it is, whether it's at work or in your homeschool group or in our church or whatever it may be, you expect to have a schedule or a deadline or something. If there's a plan in place, you have your role to fulfill in that. You know when you need to jump in and do your thing. Whether you do it or not is kind of up to you, but you know when you're supposed to be doing what you're supposed to be doing. That's the idea. Now, the angels, you would think they would know. You would think they would have advance notice for when they're going to have to jump in and start gathering the elect from the four winds. But in fact, Jesus says in particular that they don't know the time of his return. Even the angels don't know when they're going to be sent out on their final task in this age, even though by all rights they should know because they're a part of that. The angels, like us, must keep an unwavering watch for the day of the Lord's return. They have to just kind of always be ready to go whenever God finally tells them to go. So there's another group that doesn't know even though they should know. Thirdly, and finally, and most shockingly, Christ himself does not know, even though he should know, he does not know the time of his own return, as he says in the passage today. And that is probably the strangest observation of all. In the army, what general doesn't know the time of the invasion that he must lead? It's kind of his decision even. Just usually he's the guy making all this stuff happen. They usually know. What president doesn't know the time when his term begins? There's a very set date for that, when he becomes the most powerful man in the nation. He usually knows that. What performer doesn't know the time of the performance, when the concert begins or whatever? Usually they know those sorts of things. And yet Christ does not know the time of his return. He's the main character. He's the chief figure involved in this event, and even he doesn't know when it's happening. Now, not only do we expect Christ to know just because he's the central figure in his own return, but let's not forget who he is, or what he is more accurately. He's the Son of God, right? He's the radiance of his glory. He's the exact image of his nature, in whom all the fullness of Godhood dwells bodily. Those are the kinds of statements made about Jesus in the New Testament. And that's who he is. The Son of God is very much God the Son. He is the fullness of Godhood in bodily form. And based on all those biblical descriptions of Christ, we expect him to know as much as the Father knows, right? And there are times where he seems to demonstrate that kind of knowledge on other occasions. So you would expect him to know the time of his return just for that reason. But he doesn't know the time of his return, and he tells us that expressly. So great is our expectation, in fact, that Christ should know the time of his return, that Christians are very often uncomfortable with the remark he makes here, that even he doesn't know the time of his return. A lot of Christians have scratched their head at this and not greeted it with exactly enthusiasm, I would say. Just to give you an example of this that's maybe in front of you, depending on what kind of edition of the Bible you have here, you might have a marginal note here in Matthew 24, verse 36, to the effect that some copies of Matthew don't even include this remark about the Son not knowing. I mean, you might say, some manuscripts don't include this. It's like, well, what happened there? Like, well, one of two things happened. Possibly, some of the early Christians were so uncomfortable with this remark that they refused to copy it, thinking it was a mistake of some earlier scribe, perhaps. They don't want to write that down. Of course Jesus knows the time of his own return. They're not going to record that he doesn't know. Of course not. That might be what happened. Or possibly, this is perhaps a more interesting suggestion, Matthew himself was so uncomfortable with this remark that Matthew did not want to record it, and later Christians had to fill it in from Mark's gospel, who certainly includes it. See, Mark is the most candid gospel. He's willing to include all this stuff that no one else wants to, about Jesus being angry and the disciples being idiots and those kinds of things. So Mark doesn't care. He'll write down anything. But Matthew is like, I don't know if I want to write that down. And then maybe some later Christians came in and said, nope, Mark has it. It belongs here. One of those two things could have happened. But the very fact that we have this kind of discrepancy in our copies of Matthew shows you something, that there were some people in the history of the church that were not comfortable with this statement. And of course, in Christian discussions of this passage, you feel that tension as well. We don't like saying that Jesus doesn't know. Even though he said he doesn't know, Mark records it most certainly. In all likelihood, Matthew probably did. I mean, just looking at all the textual evidence for this. But the point is, that's how uncomfortable we've often been with this idea of Jesus not knowing about the date of his own return. So all the same, that's the situation that he is in. The same as the angels, the same as us. All these people who ought to know, they don't know the time of his return. Which means we all together, all of us, have no choice but to watch for the return of Christ. We have that responsibility, the angels do, and Jesus, I guess, is just watching his Father to know when to go. And that's pretty much all that we can conclude based on what he says. Now, I've spent 2 sermons refuting the claims of people who argue that we can know the time of Christ's return. So I trust that you have no delusions of that kind anymore, if you ever did. And if perhaps I have not done a very good job of arguing it, there's nothing really more I can do, because I've done everything I know to do to try to convey to you all that there is just no way to know when Jesus is going to return. But what you need to know, what you need to see now, is that God the Father is keeping the Lord's return a secret, so closely guarded that he has whispered nothing about it to anyone, not even his own Son, not even him. Therefore, our only response to this is to keep this kind of unwavering watch where we are always ready for the Lord's return, since he could come at any time. Since he could come at any time, we have no choice but to always be ready for the day of his return. Now we have a second motivation for keeping this unwavering watch, and that is that the time of the Lord's return is scheduled during worldly distractions. Let's read the passage again, this time focusing more on the middle part of it. It says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming." Now, focusing on the analogy Jesus gives of the flood in Noah's day, the wickedness of the world before the great flood was not simply violence, but forgetfulness, or you might say distraction, to use another word. So let's think about those times and what's going on. According to Jesus, in Noah's day, people were so consumed by the good things in life, eating and drinking and marriage, all good things, that they paid no attention to a holy man predicting a flood and going so far as to build an ark. And if you read about the size of that ark, it's pretty hard to miss, and surely people would be talking about that, but no one's really paying any attention to that. Also, I guess as it got closer to the day of the flood, they paid no attention when all these animals started swarming the area, moving against their normal patterns and habits. I mean, think about you're at your wedding feast while someone's getting married and 2 elephants go charging by. You don't pay any attention to that. Just keep on going with the feast. Don't need to bother with all these animals showing up in the area and going in the direction of that crazy guy building that big boat. Don't worry about any of that. Just keep on keeping on with the eating and the drinking, getting married, all those sorts of things. That's what was going on in that time. Surrounded by their many good things, they lost everything, their lives included, when the flood actually came. Both believers and unbelievers, in fact, have a very difficult time appropriating this teaching. But, again, to say again, I've said this, I think, in some way, shape, or form constantly throughout the Olivet Discourse, but the return of Christ will not happen during bad times. That's not the idea that you get from reading these portions of the Bible that deal with this more directly. See, this is how most people think of the end of the age. They believe it will come in the middle of crisis and upsets and all these terrible things, and then the return of Christ is just kind of the capstone on all of that. That's how most people think of it. But Christ says the opposite. Just as the flood came when people were eating and drinking and getting married, Christ will return when people are working in the field and grinding at the mill, driving to the office, shopping at the store, whatever kinds of things make up your ordinary life. That's what you're going to be doing when Jesus returns. It's not like you're going to be like running from armies of the undead or something. That's not the kind of thing that we expect from reading the Bible. It's not like the world all goes to pieces and then Jesus comes back. No, stuff is great. Things are going well. And then Jesus returns in the middle of all of that. When you wake up in the morning and the sun is shining brightly and the birds are singing and all the children are well behaved and breakfast was wonderful and you're looking forward to a good day at work and there's peace in the Middle East, that's when Jesus is going to return and destroy all of that, finally and forever. Game over. That's when Jesus returns. When everything is going just well, just everything's fine, that's when Jesus returns. And because everything will be so great, the entire world will be distracted instead of being watchful for the Lord's return. They're going to be distracted by their job. They're going to be distracted by somebody getting married. They're going to be distracted by this or that, something or other. They're going to be too preoccupied with those things to be watching for the return of Christ. The great burden of the Christian is to be heavenly minded, even when heaven seems to be a place on earth. Even when you're living kind of your best life now, as the saying might go, even in that time, you've got to realize Jesus is going to come back to smash all this stuff, and I've got to be ready to switch gears and take part in that whenever he returns. To read another passage on this that I find really helpful from one of Paul's letters, this is Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, on the topic of being heavenly minded at all times. He says this, "Therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on the things that are on the earth. For you all have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory." That's the idea of being heavenly minded to the point where you're focused on the heavenly things, things above, and not distracted by all this good stuff. Now at this point, I'd like to return to the analogy I gave about the older brothers and sisters watching the younger kids at the beginning of the sermon. If you're told to watch one of the younger children, you have to actually watch, as I was saying earlier. That's your job. That's what you need to focus on doing. What you cannot do is become focused on your tablet or your computer or practicing sports or piano or even doing homework or something which otherwise might be responsible. I mean, there are all kinds of good ways to spend your time, but if you're supposed to be watching this little kid over here, none of that is responsible anymore. This is responsible. This is what it means to be responsible, doing the job you were given. Instead of all those other things, you must watch. The problem is, and you know this, watching is not very fun. And those other things you'd rather be doing, they're probably more agreeable to you. You probably would rather be doing those things than watching one of your younger brothers or sisters and all that. But the fact is, that just means you have to redouble your efforts. You have to put all the more focus on this. You have to actually redouble your efforts to watch, to make sure you don't become distracted by other matters. Because those other things are really good. You want to be doing those other things, but you can't. You got to focus on watching this kid. And likewise, Christians must make that redoubled effort not to be consumed by all these worldly distractions going on at the same time as the Lord's return. You can't be so consumed with the eating and the drinking and the marrying and the giving in marriage and whatever you want to do. You can't be so distracted by those things that the Lord's return fades into the background and has no effect on your life whatsoever. You cannot let yourself get to that point. And we have a third reason to be watchful for the return of Christ. And this time, it's this, that the Lord's return comes with a selective judgment. So let's read again a part of this over here in Matthew 24. I have in mind verses 39 through 41. It says, "And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, and one will be left." Now, when Jesus says that one will be taken and another will be left, he means that one is going to be taken in judgment and the other one will be left alive. That is the way I understand that, and that is the way I will argue it here. And I can say that with a good amount of confidence. I'm very comfortable saying that. The thing is, I know that a good number of Christians don't take it that way. So I actually have to spend some time on this before I can make my real point about all these things. Most Christians, I think, at least in our time and our place, understand these verses very differently. They understand that these people being taken are being taken to heaven in an event they call the Rapture. If you've ever heard that word, that's what we're referring to now. So this so-called Rapture is an event, allegedly, in which Christ actually returns several years before his real return, and he comes to spirit away his church into heaven for a while before the end. So there's kind of 2 second comings in this way of viewing it. And so Jesus returns before he really returns and takes his church out of the world to be with him in heaven, while everything goes to pieces here on earth and then Jesus really comes back later. That's the way they view this kind of thing. Now, to such Christians, this talk of people being taken while they're in the field or grinding at the mill here in this passage, they think that's what is going on here. They're being taken up to heaven in the rapture, and everyone else is left behind on the earth. Now, that's very common for people to take it that way. However, I believe that the stronger argument is that the people being taken are unbelievers being taken in judgment. So this actually is an act of judgment being described by Jesus. Now, I say that because the comparison being made by Christ is between his return and the great flood, and in the flood, people were taken in judgment. Now, I'm going to read this again, and I am reading from the NASB, so those of you who have the NASB will see what I'm doing here. The rest of you can wait a few minutes while I talk about the NASB here for a second. So again, to read the verses, verse 39 through 41. and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Now in the NASB, the connection is very clear because they use the same word, took or taken, different forms of different conjugations of the same verb, if you want to use the grammatical language there. In all 3 verses, they use a variation of the word took, right? So it makes a pretty strong connection. You got people taken away in the flood, in judgment, and these people are taken, while they are working in the field or grinding at the mill. Now, I would love to say, because it would be a really super tight argument, I would love to say that Matthew's Greek text does the exact same thing, but it doesn't. This is somewhat of an interpretation of the NASB because Matthew doesn't use the same verb all the way through. He uses a different verb for the event of the flood. Those of you using the ESV see the people being swept away in the flood. So not taken, they are swept away, which is a decent translation, and I have no problem with that whatsoever. The real point I'm trying to make here is in the analogy given by Jesus between the flood and these people being taken at the time of his return, the people being moved somehow from one place to another suddenly and rapidly are the people in being judged. In the flood, it was certainly that way. I mean, one minute you're fine, the next minute, you're kind of being swept away by all this water. Here in the return of Christ, it's like you're out there working in your field and whoosh, you're removed from one place to another. And that's the comparison being made. So it's not necessarily a matter of the same word being used all the way through, but think about the action. The people being moved rapidly from one place to another are the people being judged in the flood. Therefore, I think when the people are being taken from the field or from the mill, they too are also being judged. I think that is a more natural way of reading it. The NASB is very helpful in that they kind of give you this kind of cue in the way they've translated it, but even in the ESV, I think you can come to that conclusion if you pay careful attention to the analogy being made by Jesus. All that to say, when Jesus says that one will be taken and another left, he means that one is going to be taken in judgment and the other is going to be left alive. That's how I understand it, and I think it's a more arguable, I think it's easier to argue for that than to say this thing about the rapture, which has all kinds of other problems with it. That's for another sermon. Now, making this comparison as I've laid it out here, and as Jesus lays it out, Jesus does, however, show one great difference between the flood and his return, and that is the selectiveness of the judgment being performed. That is how precise it is, how focused it is. Now, the flood was more like a bomb, if you want to think of it that way. Whereas the return of Christ, I'm thinking more like a sniper rifle, if you want to compare different weapons that do different kinds of damage. During the flood, if you were not on the ark, you died. Right? Pretty simple. That's the whole idea, right? Only the people that are actually on board the ark with Noah actually survived. And once you realized that the rain was not stopping and the water level was above your housetop, you knew that you were going to die at that point. You also knew that everyone else was going to die. It was wholesale, worldwide, everyone except the people on that ark, everyone dies. Kind of like a bomb, like a big bomb, like a nuclear bomb. Now the return of Christ will be very different. This is a different kind of judgment worked by God. 2 people working side by side will have very different reactions and very different fates when the sky breaks open at the return of Christ. 2 people side by side doing the same thing in the same place, totally different results. Also, each person will face different destinies, even though they were together. I mean, they were right there, working side by side, but ended up in completely different places, in completely different destinies. Now, that's what I mean by selectiveness. Like, here you got 2 people right side by side. This is more like a sniper rifle. This is more like a bullet comes through and just pegs this one guy, leaves the other one alive. That's what the return of Christ is going to be like. Now, this great selectiveness in who is taken away in judgment and who is left alive to enjoy the Lord's return is the very thing which should make us watchful. If you knew For example, and this kind of gets into kind of morbid thinking, but I've given my analogies and now I have to carry them through, right? If you knew that there was a bomb in this building and that you could not get away from it, you would probably just give up and resign yourself to death, or you would just freak out and start running around. One of two things would happen. But the fact is, you know you're going to die, that's it, game over. But if I told you that snipers were after you, you would probably make a run for it. You'd probably be ducking and dodging behind cover, trying to avoid the path of a bullet. You might be doing that kind of thing because you know you might have a chance. It's possible to dodge a bullet. People do it from time to time. Depends on how good the sniper is and how fast you are. But you could make it, right? Well, in the same way, this selectiveness of the final judgment encourages a very different response than what was going on back there in the flood. It actually encourages us to take action, to do something, because it might actually work. In this case, the return of Christ is going to cause us to consider ourselves very carefully, to make every effort to survive, even if the rest of the world might be doomed. Right? We're going to take every effort we can make to avoid those bullets when they come flying. That when Jesus comes back, we are ready so that we survive this very selective judgment that is coming at the return of Christ, when one man is taken from the field and the other is left alive. This actually inspires us to this watchfulness, to be looking over our shoulder for the time those sniper bullets start coming through. All right, so we've seen everything which should motivate us to watch for the Lord's return, at least here in this passage. And now that we've done that, we need to learn how to watch for the Lord's return. I've been speaking, of that phrase, watch, be ready, be alert, those kinds of things. And I've given all these analogies that are very physical. Jesus gives the flood. I'm talking about bombs and snipers and things like that. But this is very different. This is a spiritual kind of thing, right? This is a spiritual watchfulness. So standing outside at all hours looking up at the sky, eyes unblinking, will not help you be ready for the Lord's return. It's not that kind of watching. It's not exactly what we have in mind. Our watch is a spiritual watch. This is a matter of having your heart and your mind ready for these things. Now, thankfully, Jesus tells us 4 parables to teach us how to watch for his return. He doesn't just kind of leave the idea vague. He gives us an idea from these parables that follow this passage about what it means to be ready for his return and to be alert. Now, for today, I'm simply going to read these parables and make some remarks on them. I plan separate sermons for all of these parables later on as we go through the Olivet Discourse. So we will come back to these things. But for right now, I'm just going to read them, and I'm going to remark that the time of the Lord's return should be met by us with fear, faithfulness, and forethought. Those are the 3 words that I've come up with to kind of summarize what these parables are really getting at for how we should be waiting for the Lord's return and being alert for his return. So first, we should meet the Lord's return with the right kind of fear. And I mean to use that word. I'm not one of these preachers that's afraid to talk about fearing God. We're supposed to meet this with the right kind of fear. Now, in this first parable, Jesus says he will come like a thief, not to give, but to take away. Right? That's what a thief does. Nothing good about a thief. So here's what he says. He says, so start in verse 43. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. And we must realize that anyone not ready for the Lord's return will be destroyed by the Lord's return, just as a thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus said that elsewhere. And amazingly, Jesus uses here the analogy of a thief to describe his own coming. When he shows up, it's going to be a lot of bad for a lot of people, right? You got to be ready for that. In the same way, you should meet this then with a kind of fear. If I told you that there was a thief trying to break into your house, you would be fearful of that, and you would take actions based on your fear. Well, that's the kind of fear we're talking about. The Lord's return should be met with the right kind of fear, a holy dread that we might receive the worst part of his return if we waver in our watchfulness. Meanwhile, if we stay alert, there's no reason to worry. But, of course, it's that fear that's going to give you that sharpness that you need to stay awake and alert and ready for the Lord's return. So fear is an essential ingredient in how we watch for the Lord's return. Secondly, the Lord's return should be met with a genuine faithfulness. And this is where we get into the next parable. And the key word here is faithfulness, which Jesus actually uses in the parable. So let's read verses 45 through 51. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves, and eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour when he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now the way that ends kind of gets back to the fear factor I was talking about, but we're not actually talking about that this time. Now we're talking about faithfulness. So alongside the emotional requirement of fear, we now have the moral requirement of faithfulness, doing what a good servant is supposed to be doing for his master. Discharge all of your duties as a disciple faithfully, as though Christ were standing over your shoulder, because he may be standing over your shoulder 2 seconds from now. That's the idea. He could come at any time, and when he comes, he should find you working diligently for the work of the kingdom. Whatever it is you can be doing as a Christian, those are the things you ought to be doing faithfully, so that you're doing those things when he comes. Thirdly, the Lord's return should be met with forethought. And for this we come to the next parable. This is Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. This is the parable of the virgins. So again, verses 1 through 13. Then the kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were prudent, which means wise. Prudence is the kind of wisdom that looks to the future. That's what prudence is. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps. Now while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. But at midnight there was a shout, Behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the prudent answered, No, there will not be enough for us and for you too. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves. And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. Later the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open up for us. But he answered, Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Be on the alert then, for you do not know the day nor the hour. Now, 5 of these 10 virgins made sure to have all the oil they would need for their lamps. They were prudent in that way. They looked ahead to the future. They said, we might need more oil, so they got more oil, right? Now, I suppose we would say they bought extra batteries for their flashlights, or however you want to modernize this, but that's the idea. They actually took it a step further. They actually made plans in case things didn't go according to plan. Now, alongside, therefore, the emotional requirement of fear and the moral requirement of faithfulness, we see a mental requirement of forethought. You're actually supposed to use your brain for this part of things. As you plan your goals, your methods, and your schedules, be sure to make time and use that time for spiritual disciplines and kingdom work, or else you will be found lacking those things when you need them. Don't just let life happen to you. Sit down and discipline yourself for godliness, as Paul says somewhere in one of his letters. Actually make a plan to be godly, to actually seek the things that are God's, so that when Jesus actually comes, you're not left without oil for your lamp, so to speak, to use the language of the parable. Actually plan it out, think it through. That's what I mean by forethought. You've got to put some forethought into godliness. Now Jesus tells one more parable, which I think includes all that I have said. It's got the fear, it's got the faithfulness, and it's got the forethought. So let's read this last parable. This is Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To the one he gave 5 talents. Now a talent is a unit of money back then, so it's a lot of money. Okay. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And then he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Also the one who had received 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I've gained you 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had also received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, You wicked, lazy slave. You knew that I reap where I do not sow, and gather where I scatter no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him, and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, the example of the one lazy servant ought to inspire a sense of fear, right? He did things the wrong way. He didn't really do anything. I mean, there was an option for him to make some money based on that 1 talent. He just didn't make use of it. So he didn't do anything. He was too lazy. And the way it ends with him is not at all good. That should inspire a sense of fear in us. Meanwhile, you have 2 faithful slaves who become examples of faithfulness to us. They did something with the money they were given. Now, one of them did better than the other, but that doesn't matter. They both got the same response because they were faithful, and that's what matters. So it doesn't matter like how productive your faithfulness is. All that matters is that you're faithful to Christ upon his return. And that we're inspired therefore to faithfulness by these guys. And if you want to make a good use of your talents, you're going to need some forethought. You've got to sit down and come up with a plan. Like, how am I going to take this little bit of money and make more money with it, right? They had to do that. We don't have a lot of detail on how they made the additional money, but it took planning, I'm sure. And more planning than that lazy servant did. So there's forethought involved in this as well. So this parable kind of sums up everything. You got the fear, you got the faithfulness, and you got the forethought. And all of those things are necessary as we watch for the Lord's return, as we try to be alert. Those things should have a place in our lives as we go about our lives as Christians, watching for the Lord's return. So that brings us to the conclusion of these things. At the beginning of this sermon, I commented that this unwavering watch includes practically everything in the Christian life. And I think now that I've given you some detail, you can see why I say that. I'm going to go through the headings again, and as we review these, you can see how it really does cover a huge portion of the Christian life. So first, the time of the Lord's return is unknown even to those who should know, right? We talked about how we don't know, the angels don't know, Jesus himself doesn't know. Therefore, we must submit ourselves in humility to God's plan, come what may. Like whatever God decides to do, he's going to do it. Part of being a Christian is submitting to that and being ready to do what God does. I mean, basically, whenever he decides to send Christ back, we got to be on board with that when he comes. That takes some humility. The time of the Lord's return also is scheduled during worldly distractions, like people had during the flood in Noah's day. Therefore, we have to redouble our efforts to be heavenly minded. That's a huge part of the Christian life, keeping your mind set on things above. Thirdly, the time of the Lord's return comes with a selective judgment. This is where I was talking about bombs and snipers and stuff, about how when Jesus comes, it's a very selective judgment. Some people are taken in judgment, some are not. They're left alive. Therefore, we have to closely guard our own souls. We have to take action to make sure that we're not the ones that fall under that selective judgment whenever Jesus comes. We want to be the guy working in the field who's left alive and not the one struck down by the judgment of God or taken away by the judgment of God, as Jesus words it. Finally, the time of the Lord's return should be met with fear and faithfulness and forethought, which I think includes practically anything else that I've not mentioned yet as part of the Christian life. Fearing God, being faithful to his commands, and exercising some forethought in making sure that you are, in a sense, always repenting, as we sometimes say. All of that is a huge part of the Christian life as well. So really, again, like I said, this idea of being alert for the Lord's return, it brings with it everything else about the Christian life. And again, as I said toward the beginning, our eternity kind of hinges, our lives hinge on these two events, the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ, which is the one we're waiting for. When he came the first time, Jesus united God and man in peace through his blood, offered as a sacrifice for our sins, and rose from the dead to guarantee mankind a place at the right hand of God forever, which sounds really good. That's why we call it the good news. It's the gospel. But none of that will do you any good, no good at all, if you fail to watch for the second coming of Christ. If you fail in that, it's all for nothing. All kinds of people will benefit from the salvation worked by Christ, but you won't. You'll be one of the ones taken away in judgment. You don't want that. Rejoicing in the death and resurrection of Christ on your behalf, but failing to watch for his return, it's like trying to use a pair of scissors with just one blade. You just got the one blade, you're trying to cut something. That doesn't work very well. That's why you put that other blade on there. You need both of those together. You got to have both of this, right? Yes, rejoice in what Christ has done for our souls and the way of salvation, but you also have to be alert for his return. That's the other part of the Christian life that you've got to keep in mind. So on that note, I have one more scripture to read here. This is from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. He says this, we're kind of jumping in the middle here, but Paul says, in the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. And that's a phrase that I want you to take away with you here. Loving his appearing, right? That's how Paul describes Christians. These are the people who love the appearing of Christ. Hasn't even happened yet, but we already love it. And what do you do when you love something? Like you just really want it, you crave it, you're waiting for it if you don't yet have it, and that's exactly the idea. Be sure that you love the appearance of Christ so much that you watch for it unwaveringly. And that is really all I have to say today on this. That's really all I have to say together on this particular passage of the Olivet Discourse. That's the last of my 3 sermons on this passage. So next time what I will do, I actually want to do a comparison between what we've been studying in Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse and a very similar passage from Luke chapter 17. So if you want to prepare yourselves, you can read Luke chapter 17 and you'll see some familiar stuff in there. But I want to do a comparison between that stuff in Luke 17 and all that we've been studying in Matthew's Gospel, because I think that comparison will be helpful in some way or other. So I want to do that, and that's the next time. But for now, are there questions or comments on things that I've said on this whole idea of being alert for the Lord's return?